ongoing research and a little bit of history of where it came from. Last year, we, as a kind of a development that came from what Urban Body was doing for a few years, looking at, I wouldn't say slums, informal dwelling, oppressed societies. We did the homeless in Madrid, the hutongs in China, in Beijing 1 year before the preparation of the Olympic Games, which were clearing out a lot of the city center, and went a bit further. And at one point, the idea of slumming and the 2007 UN report, which came about, which stated two things, two predominant things, which are important for us. They had a previous report in 2003, which also started to illustrate this, but only became confirmed in 2007, which said basically that we have 1 billion slummers right now, globally, which we understand. Yet at the same time, they said the tendency and the growth of this slum development is as such that by 2020, 50% of the global urban surface will be a self-organized slum-like form. So not preconceived, not pre-designed, and not regulated, with the use of our old methodologies and our old systems. 2030, perhaps 2040, 70% of the global urban surface will be an informal, self-organized form. And these are two numbers which, no matter what we do now, we won't stop at. Because we've got 1 billion slummers, we've got a couple of billion people still living in a rural lifestyle, who are still trying to enter urban life, city life, but are not going to enter the city in the front door. So China, for example, 1.3 billion inhabitants, 500 million of them are living in the city. 800 million are still waiting to enter the city. So we have this huge phenomenon taking place. So it was a little bit about that idea of, okay, so what is the future of our urban life? You know, the future of our urban environment? That kind of triggered us to start thinking about alternative urbanism, alternative urbanities taking place, and what we can do right now. And there's been 30 or 40 years of worst case practice, I like to say, because there's not one real example when you ask people about a good urban redevelopment plan that deals with slums or a slum upgrading plan that has actually worked. There's no model yet. We did last year, some of you know, Cape Town, Cape Flats, also looking at a big slum development taking place there. And there also, even with all the most ingenious ideas they have, they still have a deficit, a yearly deficit of 30,000 houses. Because of the increase of slum housing needed to what they're trying to produce using social housing concepts, but then slightly modified. So this is a bit of a background that led up to the focus on urban emergencies. So about the idea of looking at an emergent urban form, and if we are going to be confronting this as a new future, what can we start doing with our students, what can we start doing with academia, to not even think we can resolve this problem that hasn't been resolved by many people who tried before us, but simply, at this very early phase, start to understand it. So this was the primary focus of the urban emergencies. And we did that by basically taking 2 case studies. In fact, 3 case studies were done in the faculty. The DSD focused on Mexico. Within the urban body, we focused on 2 other areas, which was the Gypsy community of Rome and Belgrade, Estonia, so Europe, which were living also in kind of slum formation. And a big case study in Asia, by taking Dharavi, being one of the largest slums in the world, the largest in Asia, which in fact is a mega slum. That research which we did last year with 2 parallel case studies, looking basically and trying to learn and trying to redefine the word slum. Because it was a little bit of an annoyance to us that the word slum was being used. Favela is another word, a township is another word. I mean, every city and every culture will have its own terminology. But it didn't explain very much. It wasn't intelligent. It was something that just was more aesthetically based to say, okay, it looks dirty, it's a little bit unhygienic, it might be dangerous, thus a slum. Now, 80% of Mumbai is living formally in a slum. So that's 17 million people of all of Mumbai. But that doesn't mean that they're poor. For example, in the case of Dharavi, which is a slum, a mega slum, where 1 million people were living in, they have a yearly turnover of 500 million. So there are fantastically rich people living in slums too. So the idea was really to go saying, well, let's not call it slum, let's just start trying to understand this. So this being a little bit of a background, But we lost a lot of that research, unfortunately, after the fire, because these two workshops were carried out in February and March, and we had our exhibition in April, and in May we lost a lot of it, which was there. So this is being reproduced, and we're using now the past year and coming half year to kind of really pick up the fragments, because it's been scattered all over the place, and we have to collect it from all of our old students again. However, this was the moment, of course, in May when that fire took place, and it kind of put our topic in another light. It kind of brought it a little bit more closer to home. We had earlier in the year, right in the month of February, actually built a settlement outside our faculty, a kind of a transitional settlement, as a kind of preparation for the students. So the subject matter came very close to home, and the idea was then requested to me by the dean, and this came a little bit out of interest that was growing from a bunch of students, to say, you know, what do we know about this issue of emergencies? What do we know this issue about disasters? And come to know, of course, studying slum conditions in the world, they are the people who are usually inhabiting these disaster-prone areas. Mudslides that we find in Caracas and in South America, typhoon areas in Southeast Asia. Usually it's the lower-income slummers that are inhabiting these kind of spaces. So once again, a new topic which was not so distinct, very similar issues, very similar discourses were taking place regarding emergencies and its emergencies phenomenon. So we started to look into that and said, okay, well, let's do a follow-up pilot studio, a kind of a research into understanding the phenomena of post-disaster. Once again, we went into the books, we looked into the history, and we looked at what's being done. And again, there is 40 years of worst-case practice, because anyone tells you about a good post-disaster redevelopment or reconstruction, they won't be able to give you a single example. Not in Asia, not in Latin America, and definitely not in Africa. So the United Nations, and we looked at the Red Cross, all these different larger international organizations are constantly looking forward. They're constantly with the next disaster. They're constantly with the next transition. And the ideas that they're basing a lot of their logics on, the ideas that they're basing a lot of their guidelines on, as to dimensions, sizes, the settlement accounts, etc., are coming from people who, most of them are coming from Oxford and let's say other places in basically a suburban lifestyle they grew up in. These are people both in England and in Americas, which use those same philosophies. This is what urban life is about, and use those same kind of philosophies as far as their spatial layout is concerned. Of course, this suburban mentality, which you find back in the guidebooks, is highly questionable for people who are actually living very much in dense city centers, looking for, usually as economic refugees, as a way of life. So we started to say, okay, we don't know if the guidelines are not working. We don't know if the assumptions that are being used are right or not. All we can do is take a chance using students, because as I said, the Red Cross and the United Nations are always looking forward. They've hardly any re-evaluation of their own interventions, whether it's a transitional center or whether it's a permanent center. They have got very little feedback. And that's simply because they don't have the time or the money to look backwards. And they're most of the time looking forward. Okay. So we said, okay, let's take an opportunity. Let's take a couple of students. Let's take a couple of locations. And we decided to focus on basically with three criteria. Let's look at post-disaster areas. Okay. So we want to look at post-disaster areas, but with three conditions. One, in urban areas. Two, in developing countries. And three, not post-conflict, but post-disaster, to see the difference between a natural disaster and basically a humanitarian disaster, either because of war or because of famine. So no slow disasters. This was basically done to say, where's the influence? And when you ask, why developing countries, we didn't want to do a New Orleans, for example. We wouldn't be doing a place like Italy, for example. But we chose areas where the foreign influence, where foreign aid comes to these developing nations, and to a certain extent imposes certain criteria, and tries to translate Western or Occidental spatial planning ideas into these settlements.